During the Big Bug Out to Ham Hung, General Oliver Smith's Unified Marine Army ROK units fought 14 divisions from 4 Chinese Communist Army groups and inflicted 38,000 casualties. Since landing at Wonsan, the Marines had suffered 4,400 battle casualties, including 718 dead, 192 missing, and hundreds of cases of untreated frostbite. They left nothing behind but a battlefield strewn with Chinese corpses and useless equipment. By December 10, 1950, Marines were the only American division north of the 38th parallel with the capability and will to fight. Smith began withdrawing through Hungnam only after receiving direct orders from MacArthur. On that day, Admiral Doyle's task force began embarking 105,000 U.S. and ROK troops, 91,000 civilians, and 350,000 tons of supplies. The evacuation took 2 weeks. Relieved to see the Leathernecks go, the Chinese did not interfere. The rout of the 8th Army placed the UNC General Headquarters in a state of total panic. MacArthur dispatched a series of frantic reports to Washington, warning of the impending annihilation of the UNC. Despite the risk of further escalation, he called for direct military action against China. The use of atomic weapons was not excluded in his demand. Escalating the war appeared very dangerous to the Truman administration and the USA's allies. Seeking total victory against North Korea had already brought China into the conflict. With a very weak conventional force in Europe, the West could not risk a war with the Soviets. Even if the Soviet Union did not intervene, the USA and UNC would be immersed in a wider war in Asia that would demand a huge military commitment. In the following weeks, although still searching for a course of action, the USA hesitantly supported 2 resolutions in the UN for an immediate ceasefire. Mao rejected the resolutions. It was evident that the USA needed to find an alternative between withdrawal and escalation. In other words, a means of fighting a limited war. In a limited war, the total defeat of the opponent is not the goal. In early December, the JCS and the State Department discussions regarding fighting a limited war were very tentative. There was a great deal of uncertainty over whether the UNC could actually withstand the communist onslaught. In a press conference on November 30th, Truman stated that the USA would take any steps necessary to meet the military situation. When asked if this included the use of the atomic bomb, he replied, "There has always been active consideration of its use." Although Truman had no intention of using atomic weapons, the statement greatly frightened Western governments. The British Prime Minister Clement Attlee immediately flew to Washington for a meeting with Truman. He and the American president agreed on the need to fight a limited war and hold the UNC position in Korea as long as possible. The goal of liberating North Korea was abandoned. In a joint communiqué on December 8th, the 2 leaders called for negotiations with the communists. The JCS issued MacArthur a strategic directive on December 29, 1950. It stated that a decisive victory would not be sought in Korea or the People's Republic of China. MacArthur was instructed to hold his position in Korea without risking the safety of his forces. In reply, MacArthur put forth his own strategy of escalation. He called for the blockade of China, airstrikes and naval bombardment against China's industry, and the reinforcement of the 8th Army with Chinese nationalist troops. MacArthur wanted nothing less than to remove the PRC as a threat to peace in Asia for generations to come. The JCS rejected MacArthur's request. Truman personally told MacArthur to avoid actions that might cause a general war. The 8th Army commander Walton Walker died on December 23rd in a Jeep accident while touring the front. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway replaced him. A renowned airborne commander in the Second World War, Matthew Ridgway was outwardly flamboyant. For example, he always sported a grenade on his webbing. Inwardly, though, Ridgway was extremely thoughtful and perceptive. Ready to adapt to difficult circumstances, he was determined to reinvigorate the Eighth Army and stop the Communists on the ground. When Ridgway took command, the Army was still in a tactical retreat. In his first week in Korea, Ridgway toured the front line and visited nearly every division commander. The men were prone to retreating. Because units failed to keep contact with the enemy, 8th Army intelligence had no idea of the enemy's strength. Also, many of the soldiers were simply not interested in fighting. Upon taking control of the battered 8th Army, one of Ridgway's first acts was to restore soldiers' confidence in themselves. To accomplish this, he aggressively went about finding other leaders in 8th Army who were not defeatists or defensive-oriented, despite the hard knocks of November and December, and put them in charge. He was quick to reward commanders who shared his sentiments, and just as quick to relieve those officers at any level who did not. During one of his briefings in Korea, at I Corps, Ridgway sat through an extensive discussion of various defensive plans and contingencies. At the end, he asked the startled staff about the status of their attack plans. The Corps G3 operations officer responded that he had no such plans. Within days, I Corps had a new G3, and the message went out. Ridgway was interested in taking the offensive. He also replaced officers who did not send out patrols to fix enemy locations and removed enemy positions from commanders' planning maps if local units had not been in contact recently. He forcefully repeated the Army slogan, "Find them, fix them, fight them, finish them off." All these positive leadership steps had a dramatic effect immediately. Ridgway's success in turning 8th Army's morale around, using little more than a magnetic personality and bold leadership, is still a model for the Army on how the power of leadership can dramatically change a situation. Perhaps another reason he was chosen was because Ridgway was not fazed by the Olympian demeanor of General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, in turn, gave Ridgway latitude in operations he had not given his predecessor. After Ridgway landed in Tokyo on Christmas Day 1950 to discuss the operational situation with MacArthur, the latter assured his new commander that the actions of 8th Army were his to conduct as he saw fit. Ridgway was encouraged to retire to successive defensive positions, as was currently underway, and hold Seoul as long as he could, but not if doing so meant that 8th Army would be isolated in an enclave around the city. In a foreshadowing of his aggressive nature, Ridgway asked specifically if he found the combat situation to my liking, whether MacArthur would have any objection to my attacking. MacArthur answered, "8th Army is yours, Matt. Do what you think best." 8th Army was in Korea to stay. In the midst of these reforms, Ridgway instituted attrition as the new operational doctrine of the 8th Army. He supported fighting a limited war and understood that warfare had changed since the Second World War. He particularly opposed the use of atomic weapons. Instead of annihilating the communists, he sought to wear down their manpower. To do so, superior UNC firepower was to be exploited to the maximum effect. The hallmark of Ridgway's doctrine of attrition was his directive to his subordinates to maximize enemy casualties while minimizing those of 8th Army. Given the communist numerical superiority, conserving casualties was critical. Not a single company was to be sacrificed. There was to be no fighting simply to hold terrain. Rather than fighting the expected communist attacks in forward positions around Seoul, Ridgway intended to withdraw carefully to the Han River. The Chinese launched the third phase offensive in sub-zero conditions on December 31, 1950. Although Ridgway was forced to abandon Seoul, his withdrawal stretched the communist supply lines to the breaking point, forcing General Peng to call off the offensive. Ridgway was anxious to seize the initiative. On January 15, 1951, He mounted a reconnaissance in force, Operation Wolfhound, followed by a full-blown offensive 10 days later, Operation Thunderbolt. In Operation Thunderbolt, the 1st and 9th Corps made a careful and step-by-step advance northward with heavy artillery and air support. The 25th U.S. Division and the Turkish Brigade pummeled the opposing 50th CPV Army in the first day of fighting. By February 9th, the 8th Army was back on the Han River. The counteroffensive surprised the CPV commanders, who had not expected such a quick UNC recovery. Overconfident, Mao ordered another attack, the short-lived and ill-advised 4th Offensive. On February 11th, Chinese forces broke through the 3rd ROK Corps and threatened the important hub of Wanzhou. Further west, the 23rd RCT and an attached French battalion were encircled at Chipyongni. Supplied by air, they fought stubbornly and took the momentum out of the Communist advance. Hoping to bring the Communists to the negotiating table, Ridgway outlined a series of offensive operations based on limited objective attacks called the Meat Grinder. A limited objective attack was a concentrated and carefully prepared set-piece assault meant to kill Communists and not take ground. In late February and March, Ridgway launched a series of colorfully named limited objective attacks, Operation Killer, Ripper, and Rugged. With General Smith now in command of 9th Army Corps and General Puller assuming command of the 1st Marine Division, General Ridgway decided it was time for a counteroffensive to be spearheaded by the Marines. Phase 1 of the plan was Operation Killer, an 8-day UN offensive that concluded February 28th and pushed Communist forces north of the Han River. Ridgway, commanding, was dissatisfied with the results of Killer. While the operation had attained its terrain objectives and interrupted the Chinese Communist plans for an immediate major offensive, it had not caused anywhere near the amount of enemy casualties Ridgway had desired. Ground taken today can be lost tomorrow, but an enemy soldier killed today has no hope of fighting tomorrow. Ridgway wanted blood, not land. With the evidence that the Chinese were still attempting to conserve their forces and set themselves for another massive attack, Ridgway resolved to continue his own drive to the north, beating the enemy to the punch. The second phase, Operation Ripper, was intended to destroy as much of the Chinese Communist People's Volunteer Army and North Korean military around Seoul and the towns of Hongshan and Cheonghan as possible. The operation also aimed to bring UN troops to the 38th parallel. Killer was launched on March 6, 1951, with the U.S. 1st Corps and 9th Corps on the west near Seoul and Hongsong, and U.S. 10th Corps and ROK 3rd Corps in the east, to reach Line Idaho south of the 38th parallel. Ripper began with the largest artillery bombardment of the Korean War. On a cold, clear morning that quickly gave way to clouds and snow, the 1st Marine Division went into the attack, with the 7th Marine Regiment on the left and the 1st Marine Regiment on the right. As in the early stages of Operation Killer, Chinese resistance was light, confining itself to scattered small arms fire from the enemy's line of outposts. By nightfall, the day's objectives had been secured at a total cost of 7 Marines wounded. The suspicions of the first day that things were going too well were confirmed on the second. The Chinese were continuing the withdrawal they had commenced the previous month, carefully picking their fights and giving battle only to cover the withdrawal of other units. They were falling back, but they were doing it very skillfully and under control. When it was required, they were ready to put up a blistering fight in one area in order to let units withdraw from an adjacent piece of ground. Chinese resistance continued to be light and sporadic on the following day, but not so light that Charlie Company, first of the first, didn't run into a lethal hornet's nest on one of the mangled ridges before San. Sergeant John Chinner earned a Navy Cross, leading his machine gun platoon through a storm of enemy fire coming from a carefully sited cluster of well-dug-in bunkers. Single-handedly, and armed only with his .45 caliber M1911 AI pistol and a supply of captured hand grenades, Chinner stormed the ridge line through murderous fire, neutralizing 5 bunkers and either killing or forcing their occupants to flee. Darkness fell with Charlie Company in uncontested possession of the ridge. As they had done so often, the Chinese turned and pulled out. Throughout the next 2 days, Marine units devoted themselves to local patrolling, while friendly units on the right that had been outpaced by the Marine advance caught up. Then, early on 11 March, it was back to business. Faced with thousands of determined Marines, the Chinese continued to give ground and fall back to the north. Pressing forward for the next 3 days, the 1st Marine Division was well established on Operation Ripper's first major objective, Phase Line Albany. On the following day, friendly units to the west found the ravaged city of Seoul abandoned by the backpedaling enemy. During the night of March 14-15, elements of the South Korean 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Division liberated Seoul, marking the 4th and last time the capital would have changed hands since June 1950. Following the recapture of Seoul, the Communist forces retreated northward, but no one expected the Chinese to abandon the fight, turn tail, and run. By the best available estimates, there were some 385,000 CCF troops in Korea, along with 120,000 North Korean soldiers, reorganizing after the beating they had absorbed the previous year and beginning to appear in action once again. They were going to require some energetic rooting out. Scarcely pausing to catch its breath on Phase Line Albany, the 1st Marines jumped off toward Hongshan and Phase Line Buffalo early on the morning of March 15th. Utilizing the rugged, muddy terrain to maximum advantage, the Communists conducted a skillful and bloody delaying action. The area was almost devoid of roads. The few that did exist were little more than ox cart trails. Dominating the whole operational area was the 2,900-foot mountain the Koreans called San. For the defender, the area was a natural stronghold. For the attacker, it was a truly nasty place. If the difficulties posed by the terrain weren't bad enough, the weather, which had been so foul throughout Operation Killer, showed no signs of improving. Corporal Austin Stack, a machine gunner in Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, remembered the period as the time of his lowest morale in Korea. Being constantly cold and wet, pelted by rain, freezing rain, sleet, and snow, and slogging wearily through a mixture of half-frozen boot-top deep snow, mud, and slush can dim the spirits of the most cheerful optimist and give pause to even the most determined masochist. Despite these obstacles, Operation Ripper pressed on throughout March. Thousands of Korean porters, utilizing the A-frame carrying rack which had been used to transport heavy burdens since the beginnings of Korea, labored up and down the nearby vertical landscape, delivering ammunition, rations, and fuel to the frontline units. Korean peasants routinely manhandled forward loads of 100 pounds and more to keep the advance moving. Cargadores, they were called officially, Marines in the ranks ever quick to borrow from the local language, dubbed them the Yobo train, from the Korean word for the carrying device they mounted their loads upon. By whatever name, they were invaluable. By one means or another, the advance kept moving. Evidence that it was disrupting Chinese plans for a fighting withdrawal came in the form of an intercepted radio communication early on 15 March. "We cannot fight any longer. We must move back today. We will move back at 1400 hours. Enemy troops will enter our position at 1300 or 1400. Enemy troops approaching fast." Late that afternoon, the lead elements of Major Webb D. Sawyer's 1st of the 7th entered Hongshan without a fight. It was a different story north of Hongshan, where for the next 3 days, the Chinese fought bitterly, battling for every lump and bump in the ground. The 1st Marines on the right had their hands full, with Chinese fighting from a succession of skillfully sited bunkers and trenches. In a series of bloody hand-to-hand encounters, up close and personal, Marines had to shoot, blast, and burn the defenders from their strongholds. On the infrequent occasions when the weather lifted, the treetop-level strikes of Marine close air support provided the element that turned the tables. The 1st Marine Division's running gun battles with the Chinese continued to follow the pattern of alternately fighting and withdrawing. Slowly but surely, however, the Chinese were being forced backward, until on March 20th the advance had reached Phase Line Buffalo. Before darkness fell, the 5th Marines, with the 1st Marines on the right and aided by deadly accurate airstrikes by Marine fighter squadrons, overran the Chinese main line of resistance. It was the KMC regiment that ran up against the heaviest fighting in the advance to Operation Ripper's final objective, Phase Line Cairo. Sandwiched between the 5th and the 1st Marines, the Korean Marines worked their way through the tortuous jumble of ridges, gullies, and ravines that fronted Hill 975. Battling pocket after pocket of resistance in a continuing rattle and crash of point-blank fire, punctuated by the detonation of grenades and mortar rounds, they moved on. Supplied by airdrops and ably supported by Lieutenant Colonel William McReynolds' 3rd Battalion 11th Marines, firing in direct support, they slugged their way forward until the issue was decided. Hongshan was taken on the 15th and Cheongkon secured on the 22nd. The capture of Cheongkon was the last major ground objective of Operation Ripper. All the objectives of Operation Ripper were now controlled by the 8th Army, which had been attacking continuously since February 21st. Still, with the evidence mounting that the CCF had not abandoned plans for a major offensive, General Ridgway wanted to find a way to keep the pressure on. MacArthur now had a clear victory, and he wanted to destroy the bridges over the Yalu to prevent the CCF from bringing more troops and supplies into Korea. To accomplish that, he would now have to battle the President of the United States.